Hi, welcome to English 394. This is about the nomination and selection of Nobel laureates, and it will give you useful information about the first assignment, which involves nominating 5 potential Nobel laureates in literature. The nomination and selection process for the Swedish Academy, by the Swedish Academy, which chooses each year's Nobel laureate in literature, is very clearly determined on the nobelprize.org website. We're going to walk through some aspects of that website. You're going to choose your 5 possible nominees. I'll show you some resources that you can look at to do that. And this will give you, I think, some ideas about how to choose your one nominee. That is your paper topic for Essay 1, which is on who will win the Nobel Prize this year in 2017. So who's going to win this year's Nobel? If you go to nobelprize.org, you'll see the following screen. I have here a screenshot of it, and you can see that there's an arrow below the nomination tab on the menu there. So you're going to want to hover your mouse over the nomination tab, and you'll see literature as one of the fields. That's your field. You want to choose that. So who's going to win this year's Nobel? To understand that, it's really useful to think about the process by which the Swedish Academy of Languages and Literature, whose job, according to Alfred Nobel's will, is to select the most outstanding candidate who has produced work in an idealistic direction. And there were a number of court cases after Alfred Nobel died. One because his descendants would have preferred that he had left his wealth to them, and the other to try to figure out what the terms of that will meant. But Alfred Nobel did persist and succeed after his death in that goal, because he, unlike the benefactors of many other prizes, provided for the funding of the administrative process by which to win the Nobel Prize. You'll see that on this first screen under nomination and selection of literature laureates that you can go to the archives and look at who the candidates were for prizes beginning in 1966. Now, how come they aren't showing more recent prizes? That would be really useful to us if that were the case, but then there would be no challenge, right? Well, the Swedish Academy has a rule saying that their archives are closed for 50 years after the fact. So next year, the 1967 ones will be available, and so forth. So we can do various things to second guess who some of those candidates might be. Here's how you learn. So who's going to win this year's Nobel? The process that we're using to a large extent mimics the process that the Swedish Academy uses. First, we want to think, though, about qualified nominators. That is, who are the people who are allowed to submit nominations to the Swedish Academy for each year's Nobel? This year, there were more than 250 nominations received by the Swedish Academy, and a nomination has to be a formal letter together with an appraisal and an indication of the strengths of that particular candidate. Qualified nominators are, for one, members of the Swedish Academy. There's 18 of them. They're called deoderten because once you're a member of the Swedish Academy, you have a chair for life. It's kind of like the Supreme Court, except bigger. And the members of other academies of languages and literatures also get to nominate. So that would be like the Real Academia Española, which is the Academy for the Spanish language, based in Spain but with corresponding members throughout the Spanish-speaking world. The Brazilian Academy of Languages and Literatures, the French Academy. Now, how come English doesn't have an Academy of Languages and Literature? Good question. Well, one of the first ways to think about that is, where would it possibly be? Would it be in England, or would it be in the United States? It would be a worldwide academy, I hope, if we had one, but we don't. So instead, there are other factors in play. Luckily, professors of literature and linguistics at universities and university colleges can also nominate. So I could nominate, and that would be fun to do. I haven't done it yet. There is a rule, however, that I cannot nominate any of my colleagues. presumably any of my students. So I'm sorry, guys. At any rate, the third one is previous Nobel laureates in literature. The most recent ones really do have a lot of say in what names get forwarded. They can forward names, and they get heard. It is often the case that you can find out who the people in the running are by looking at the friends of the people that have recently become Nobel laureates. And also there's presidents of societies of authors that are representative of literary production in the respective countries. That means groups like PEN International, for example, and there's various other ways to think about it. So national societies and international societies. The Swedish Academy, however, is the one that's going to make the last decision. And the question about who's eligible, you can't be dead and receive the Nobel Prize in Literature. The nomination has to be made for someone who is alive. And the Swedish Academy also sends out invitations to people, asking them to submit their names for consideration. So who's going to win this Nobel? Our class, as I said, mimics their process. And here you see a chart that tells you about how the Nobel laureates in literature are selected. Let's look at that chart more closely. As you can see, the invitation to nominate is sent out in September of each year. So it's a year-long process. The deadline for submitting nominations is the 31st of January. From that group of nominations, 15 to 20 preliminary candidates are chosen. So there's a wide net for receiving. Anyone can really, with a little bit of help, get their name in contention for nomination, but from those, the Swedish Academy will choose 15 to 20 preliminary candidates. Of those, 5 are chosen at the beginning of the summer as finalists, we'll call them. And here the Swedish Academy fortunately has a committee of 5 within the Academy, 5 members, which includes the permanent secretary of the Academy, who right now is Sarah Danius. She's got a PhD from Duke in French literature. She's English, French, and Swedish speaking, and she presides over that committee of 5. Those 5 candidates, there are 5 people on that committee, and they all retire to the island that the Swedish Academy owns in the south of Sweden to spend their summer reading the work of those particular candidates and making decisions, and each member presents a kind of dossier, an evaluation, a summary and evaluation of each of those 5 candidates' work. The Academy members then confer in the month of September, and then the Nobel Prize will be announced traditionally in the first or second Thursday of the month of October. So in your assignment, where you're going to submit 5 possible nominations for your discussion board this upcoming Tuesday, you're not required to think that you would back any one of these candidates. You're just going to submit 5 names of people that you think might be in the running for the Nobel Prize, and you're going to need to provide a short rationale for that, just as the Swedish Academy does. And then we will discuss on our discussion board who we think the good candidates are, the ones most likely to win the Nobel Prize, and ones that we think deserve it as well. The Nobel Prize announcement will appear in our class in our last week of class during our Nobel Prize Frenzy Week. The Nobel Prize award ceremony is held in December, and it is a source of countrywide celebrations in Sweden. Many people hold Nobel Prize parties and dress up, and the ceremonies themselves, which are held in Stockholm, include banquets with thousands of people. The royal family and other dignitaries attend. All nominations are secret for 50 years afterwards, as I mentioned. So there's a lot of secrecy around the Nobel Prize, and one of the reasons for that, you may be wondering, why so secret? Well, the Nobel Prize is worth a lot of money. It's based on the money, the endowment that Alfred Nobel, who held the patent on dynamite, that he established at the end of the 19th century. And that money was then invested in the stock market together with the money from the mines that his family owned in Russia at the time. So those nominations that are secret for 50 years, sometimes word gets out about what the Swedish Academy members are reading, and that's almost always a matter for speculation and some degree of scandal during the beginning of Nobel Week. I remember that one year the president, or the rather permanent secretary of the Swedish Academy, was seen boarding an airliner carrying a number of books by the Nobel Prize winner from that year, and so his stock suddenly shot up in the betting markets. So if we think then about this selection process, think again, when you're nominating your candidates, the writer must be alive. The prize will be awarded to the person who has produced the most outstanding work in an idealistic direction. The prize, again, is for the writer, not for a particular work, usually. Now, the Swedish Academy issues with each writer that wins what's called a Nobel citations. It's usually about 20 words, a single sentence, perhaps two, and that may mention individual works, but the prize is given for the body of work. So one of the tendencies among the winners of Nobel Prizes is that they tend to be older. There are some exceptions, but no one under the age of 40 has ever received the Nobel Prize. Another thing that you can do to get a sense is to play with the nomination database. You see the link here, and in the nomination database you can plug in the names of various writers that you may have read that have since won Nobel Prizes, say Hemingway or Steinbeck, and you'll see how many times they were nominated before they actually won and who their nominators were. And that'll give you an idea of how there are certain names that tend to be circulated, so you might want to pay attention to what those names suggested for the Nobel are if you want to write about someone who will win the Nobel Prize and be right. Because if you're right, you'll get an A on your paper regardless. It's not an easy thing to do, but it can be done. I'll talk about that more later. So, general observations. One of the predictors of the prize is authors who have won other major international prizes. And there are specific international prizes that seem to be good predictors of the Nobel Prize. One is the Man Booker International Award. It's based in England, and it comes from a combination of several leading English language publishers. And the winners of that prize have often, but not always, gone on to win the Nobel. So you look at some of the more recent winners of the Man Booker International Prize, and you'll get some ideas. Another significant predictor is the Neustadt Award for World Literature. That one's based at the University of Oklahoma, which is where the journal World Literature is published. And the Neustadt Award has often gone to someone who goes on to win the Nobel. Some of the recent winners of the Neustadt are Margaret Atwood, the Canadian writer. And I think Margaret Atwood is probably a contender. Now, one thing that she has going against her is that a Canadian very recently won the Nobel. That is the writer Alice Munro of short stories. But it's been a couple of years since Munro won, and so far Munro is Canada's only Nobel laureate. So this is a possibility. You could look at Atwood. The Jerusalem Prize is another one. It's based, oddly enough, in Jerusalem, and a most recent winner of that is the author Haruki Murakami from Japan. And Murakami, I think, is a very interesting possible choice. He is a popular author, and the Swedish Academy has tended to somewhat more academic authors of late. But even so, Murakami has gotten a lot of acclaim from academics as well, growing acclaim. And another one is the Princess of Asturias Prize, which is sponsored by the royal family in Spain. It has in the past gone to Spanish language authors, but it is increasingly going to authors who publish in other languages. So look at some of the names of the people who have won those and think about them and whether you would be interested in reading one of their books. And that would be one way for you to choose a winner for your paper that is due for the first essay. A final word here. J.K. Rowling is not going to win the Nobel. Don't nominate her. Now, why do I say she's not going to win the Nobel? For one thing, there are some negative predictors regarding the Nobel. And one is that there are no what we'll call one-trick ponies. The Swedish Academy does not like to nominate someone who does just one thing, even if they do that one thing very well. And in J.K. Rowling's case, she did a great job in developing the Harry Potter series and in getting probably more younger people to read, and her books are a lot of fun. I've read them all, and I agree, but she's very unlikely to win the Nobel. Another thing that makes her somewhat less likely to win the Nobel is that in order to win, you really need to have support from more than one country, and there needs to be support from Sweden. There needs to be support from some member of the Swedish Academy. We'll talk about that next. So, to summarize so far, no one ever wins the Nobel on a first nomination. That's pretty important. And the Swedish Academy doesn't want to do that because it's a risk to accept someone on a first nomination. Time is of the essence there. Weight is their attitude. Another is that a successful nominee really must have substantial support from more than one country. It needs to have support from a member or members of the Swedish Academy. And you can see here that I've linked that term Swedish Academy, so you can look up who those members are and see what their specialties are. And that'll give you an idea of who, for example, has an interest in French literature, who has expertise in China, and so forth. So there must be support from more than one country. And the opinions of recent winners of the Nobel really matter. What matters even more is language and translation. It is imperative that a nominee be writing in and or translated into major European languages. In the case of Chinese laureates, there is a person on the Swedish Academy who is a specialist in Chinese literature, which is as should be, but nonetheless there needs to be other translations as a way of ensuring that there's support from more than one country, that it is an international prize. And a really good way to look is to see who on the Swedish Academy might be championing a particular writer's work. That is a way to think about the Nobel. So who is the likely champion for the person you're considering? If you can identify that person, then you will be able to create a very successful and persuasive essay. The Academy tries to avoid controversy. They tend to be more traditional as opposed to innovative, although this past year's winner, Bob Dylan, suggests that they're going towards the innovation area. And there's never been a Nobel laureate from the same country 2 years in a row. So that's important. Another is to think, what groups have been underrepresented? What areas have been underrepresented? The Swedish Academy now has 6 of the 18 members are women, so there's been an increasing number of women involved in the process, and women have been able to have access to publishing more. An area that's been deeply underrepresented has been the continent of Africa. Only one Black African so far has won the Nobel Prize. So Wole Soyinka from Nigeria, and that needs to change. Central Asia is another area that's been overlooked, and the Far East in general. Now, Japan has received, Japanese authors have received 3 Nobel Prizes so far, so that might argue against Murakami winning. China has only had 1 Nobel laureate so far in literature, and I think that it would be a strong contender, if not this year, then in future years. And finally, another area of significant omission is indigenous peoples. So from Australia, the name of the Aboriginal writer Les Murray is often floated. He's likely been nominated. And then again, there's indigenous peoples in the Americas who would be strong contenders for the Nobel. Think about those. So when you choose your 5 possible nominees, you can also look at the resources that I've placed in the Week 1 Essay 1 folder. And in that, I have an Excel spreadsheet that my students from 2 years ago found extremely useful. And I had, in that class, face-to-face class, I had 16 students, and 3 of them successfully chose the Nobel. It was amazing, and I wondered if I should even hide that spreadsheet in the future. But take a look at that spreadsheet. You'll see that what I've done is I've compiled the various high-ranking people from the British betting site Ladbrokes. Yes, I know it's fairly silly because it's a sports betting site, but nonetheless, Ladbrokes accepts people making bets on who's going to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. And I took that from a 10-year period of people who had pretty high odds in the past, in the 10 days or so before the Nobel Award. And of those, you can compare how their odds tend to improve over the time as close to when they win the Nobel. I've highlighted in red the ones that have actually won the Nobel, so you can sort that way and then compare their odds. And you can also look at them by country, and that's another way to think about it. So another place to look is there's a website, the World Literature Forum, and there's a thread called Nobel Prize Literature 2017 Speculation. And in that thread, there's a number of very well-informed posts that give you the names of people, what prizes they've won, and a lot of discussion back and forth by the people that contribute to that thread. Now, that said, it is a fairly open forum, so anyone can say whatever they like. But what's good about it is that the people that are moderating the forum do seem to know, whoever they are, because people choose pseudonyms, the people moderating the forum do seem to know what they're talking about. And then Ladbrokes has a really interesting short article, I highly recommend it, in which they explain how they set the Nobel odds, at least in the case of Bob Dylan's candidacy. And that'll give you some idea of how those odds and how much weight to give to Ladbrokes. Because after all, we have had recent winners. I'm thinking specifically about the British writer Doris Lessing, who she never even appeared on the Ladbrokes list, and she won the prize. And then finally, another place is the Complete Review, which is good, but they tend to publish more on the Nobel Prize as it gets closer to the date. So you could look at their past ones. If you have any questions, please post them to our Hallway Conversations forum in the discussion board, and I'll also be announcing office hours via Google Hangouts, and I promise you every week we'll have some pretty interesting discussion of the Nobel Prize. For the Google Hangouts, I will be sending an email inviting people to join in that conversation so that we can meet in smaller groups real time for office hours. If you have further questions or hallway conversations, post them. Thanks very much. Have a great week.